Welcome and thank you for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require any technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Kiara. Welcome, everybody, to our meeting. The main item of this meeting is the consideration of our draft opinion on market enhancements for the summer 2021 readiness, which has 3 parts. What will happen in the meeting is that we'll briefly summarize those 3 parts and have then open discussion with the folks who've called in, and then we'll be considering its adoption. Prior to discussing the opinion, we will have, as we always do, a open stakeholder discussion about any topic other than what we're focusing on in this meeting. So if there's a general question or concerns that stakeholders would like to raise, that would be a time to do it. But before opening it up for general comments and questions, I'll just introduce the folks who are around the virtual table here. So from the Market Surveillance Committee, it's myself, Ben Hobbs, Dr. Jim Bushnell, Dr. Scott Harvey, and then from the ISO, we have Craig Cook, Brad Cooper, James Friedrich, Don Trethway, and Shami Davis. Okay, so first, although we don't run a stakeholder process ourselves, we are very interested in what you have to say about topics affecting the efficiency and fairness and transparency of the market. And I'd like to open up the lines now to any general comments or questions from those who have called in. And again, if you have something to say about the summer 2021 readiness, if you could hold that comment until after we introduce that opinion. So, Kiara, could you see whether there's anybody who wants to make a comment or question at this time?
Moving to Q&A, please press #2 on your telephone's keypad to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and your question. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question. There are no questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will introduce the summary of the opinion by simply saying that we were asked to comment on elements of this initiative, not every element, but certain ones that seem to be of particular interest to the public and that also concern the EIM board. There is another part of this initiative, in particular the minimum state of charge requirement, which will be considered as part of the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Phase 1. We intend to post an opinion about that next week. And there's another part of this initiative dealing with load and import-export priorities that will be discussed not this month, but next month, because it's not going to be coming before. If my understanding, it's not going to be presented to the Board of Governors this month. So the initiative recommends several changes to several features of the ISO markets, and we address the following 3 parts of the initiative. First, a revision of short-term scarcity pricing capabilities. Second, resource efficiency evaluation tests applied to individual balancing authority areas in the EIM. And then third, bid cost recovery provisions for block imports that participate in the hour-ahead scheduling procedure. And I would like to welcome Scott to the virtual podium. He will summarize those first two parts, and then I will summarize the bid cost recovery provisions. I think, Scott, if it's okay, do you think we should have public comment and questions after each part? In which case, you could introduce the first part on scarcity pricing, have a discussion, and then go to the second part? Or
that sounds like a good process to me. I think otherwise the discussion could get sort of all over the place, and we could we'll just have to monitor the time we spend on the topics. But I think that's a good idea to allow people to talk about the specific things we've said, and everybody.
Okay.
So I'll stop after getting through the scarcity pricing, and ask you and Jim to add your comments, and then we can you can ask for comments from the other stakeholders.
Okay. It's yours, Scott. Go ahead.
So the opinion notes that we support the scarcity pricing design the CAISO proposes to implement for summer 2021, and we support it as a near-term measure to reduce the likelihood of load shedding if the CAISO encounters very high load conditions this coming summer. On the other hand, we agree with the many stakeholder comments that the proposed changes for summer 21 are far from constituting a complete scarcity pricing design. In our view, the changes are fixes that the CAISO can implement before this summer using largely existing software functionalities we understand so that it can be in place for the summer. The short-term goal is to avoid outcomes in which a price signal that is completely inconsistent with system conditions once again serves to speed the slide in the load shedding. Like many other stakeholders, I imagine, after reviewing the heat wave report, we do not understand how CAISO spot prices could have remained as low as they did as the CAISO slid closer and closer to load shedding on August 14th. We now understand that when the CAISO reached the point that it needed to use generation providing reserves to meet load, it was able to continue to meet its WEC reserve requirements by arming load for load shedding to provide 10-minute non-spinning reserves, replacing the generation that had been providing those reserves. This action, in turn, allowed the operators to release the generation and providing reserves for dispatch, using that generation to meet load and to meet the upward bid range test. We also understand that when the generation that had been providing reserves was replaced by arming load, the generation was released into the dispatch without violating the load balance constraint and without any form of shortage pricing. Instead, prices were set by the incremental energy prices of the reserves dispatched to meet load, even if they were resources released from providing reserves. This price formation design had the consequence that although the CAISO was on the verge of load shedding, although the CAISO desperately needed to attract imports in HASP and the 15-minute market, and although the CAISO needed a price signal to tell the batteries to discharge, not charge an RTD, prices were instead set at levels reflecting normal operating conditions. Thus, when the CAISO reached the point that the next step the operators would have to take was to initiate rolling blackouts, prices nevertheless remained low, set by incremental energy offers. It's impossible to know how much difference it would have made in practice had HASP, F&M, and RTD prices been at set levels reflecting actual system conditions, but higher prices more reflective of conditions might have enabled the CAISO to attract enough additional supply to avoid load shedding, or at least to reduce the amount and duration of load shedding. But this is not what happened in August, and this pricing seems to have ensured the outcome in which load shedding became necessary. The proposed changes are intended to ensure that this cycle does not repeat, and that it is necessary for the CAISO to arm load in order to meet its WEC reserve requirements, and a continued drawdown of its supply margin would therefore result in load shedding. With these changes in place, prices will be set at $1,000 or possibly $2,000 if Order 831 triggers, rather than being set by incremental energy offers, as will be the case under normal conditions. Hopefully the CAISO and the rest of the West will not face similar operating conditions this coming summer, but if they do and the CAISO once again finds it necessary to arm load to meet its WEC reserve requirements, it will be important to set prices at levels that will avoid the need for load shedding, instead of at levels that almost ensure it. So the scarcity pricing design is basically a quick fix that we agree with the CAISO may have significant benefits if we get into the verge of load shedding once again. That's all I had to say. Ben and Jim, why don't you take turns with your comments?
Thank you, Scott. I don't have any comments to add. I think you ably summarized it.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Okay. Operator, Kara, we're ready to take questions and comments from the audience. Can you invite folks to queue up?
As a reminder, you may press #2 on your phone's keypad to enter the question queue. There are no questions in the queue.
Okay, thank you. Scott, you can go ahead now and talk about sufficiency test.
Good. Okay, this is Scott Harvey again. In our view, the core issue relating to the resource sufficiency test is not particular changes proposed by the CAISO, but is instead whether the CAISO has in fact identified all the flaws in the way the test was applied to the CAISO in August 2020. And that subject is the main focus of the discussion in our posted opinion. We've shared the concerns of a number of EM entities as to how the CAISO could have passed the bid range sufficiency test in the hours leading up to load shedding. And we spent some time over the past few months discussing the apparent inconsistency with the CAISO. In our posted opinion, we discussed why we think the CAISO was able to pass the bid range test after it entered a state of emergency, and why we now think that the CAISO passing the bid range sufficiency test may have been the appropriate outcome. Now, we have not reviewed the details of the CAISO bid range calculations, nor have we calculated the specific impact of the factors discussed in the opinion, but our discussions with the CAISO have provided some insight into factors we believe did and did not allow the CAISO to pass the bid range test. First, we understand the concerns of many EIM entities that the CAISO may have passed the bid range test as a result of EIM imports increasing the available bid range. However, after discussing this possibility with the CAISO, we understand that these imports are added to the load requirement in the bid range sufficiency test. Hence, these imports would have no net impact on the bid range supply versus the bid range requirement. This does not mean that this calculation was correctly carried out, however, and we do not have the ability to verify this in the CAISO data. We therefore recommended that the CAISO verify that the software calculated the requirement correctly, and if it's done so, it should report this. And DMM perhaps could also examine whether the calculation was carried out correctly. But as far as the design of the calculation, the design appears to ensure that the CAISO could not pass the test as a result of the level of EIM transfers. And that leaves us and many EIM entities with a question, well, if this is not how the CAISO passed the bid range test, how did it pass? And after reflecting on it and discussing with the CAISO, we think the answer has 4 parts. First, we sense that a big part of the puzzle is the impact of the CAISO arming load in making generation reserves available to meet load and to meet the upward bid range requirement. If the CAISO armed enough load to release enough generation to meet forecast load and some amount of uncertainty, that would contribute to the CAISO passing the bid range test. Another action the CAISO was able to take once it entered a state of emergency was to activate emergency demand response, which reduced load, helping the CAISO again meet its WEC reserve requirement and to meet the bid range requirement. So it appears to us that the ability of the CAISO to meet the bid range test as a result of taking these 2 actions is appropriate. By declaring a state of emergency, the CAISO was able to meet load while also meeting its WEC reserve requirements and its upward bid requirements by activating demand response and by arming load as a consequence of entering the state of emergency. A third factor that became apparent to us is that because of the low prices in the 15-minute market after load was armed and reserves released for dispatch, which we just finished discussing as part of the scarcity pricing, there may have been some amount of 15-minute market imports that were counted for the upward bid range test, but were not scheduled to meet CAISO load. Thus, they would have gone unscheduled precisely because of the flawed pricing we just discussed. And this potential, to the extent it was a factor, would be avoided next summer by the scarcity pricing design. A fourth factor that may have contributed to CAISO passing the test is the upward bid range of resources coming online. and these resources might be able to meet only a small amount of load and not provide reserves as they were coming on load and able to ramp up to their upper limit. But we don't know the extent of that, but those are the 4 factors that we've identified. And as far as we can tell, they account for the CAISO's ability to pass the bid range test. Now, as I mentioned before, we don't have the ability to verify that this is the case, these are the only factors, and there are no remaining flaws. And as I mentioned, we therefore recommend that the CAISO verify that the key elements of the design were calculated correctly and provide more visibility to EIM participants into how the CAISO passed the bid range test, because I think that's the key concern, is confidence across the EIM that the CAISO passed because the test was calculated correctly and because of these actions we pointed to, and not because of some mistake that hasn't been discovered. I think that the CAISO could report some information on what the bid range was on the internal generation, what it was when you reduced the EIM imports to show that there still was positive bid range consistent with passing the test, then show the impact of subtracting off the armed load, and probably the CAISO would have failed without that, and show what its bid range would have been had it not activated the reliability demand response, again showing that without that action it would have failed. And then report the unscheduled 15-minute market inputs, undispatched supply and units ramping up, and assure people that there's any other factor that contributed to the bid range into the passing, to provide that assurance that other EIM entities understand what's going on with the CAISO. We also agree with the CAISO and market participants there are a number of other subjects to be examined for future improvements in the resource efficiency test, such as how offline and ramp-constrained resources are accounted for in the bid range, whether some or all the uncertainty requirement should be included in a bid range test, the potential for more appropriate penalties for failing the test. And we agree with the need to discuss all those things. We also add in the opinion that the CAISO also needs to address the inconsistency between the HAF's objective function in scheduling imports and the import schedules that will be required to pass the resource efficiency test. We need to continue to worry about the changes in the flexible ramping product to replace the uncertainty requirement based on a historical histogram with a more accurate requirement, and implementing a more accurate and workable FlexiRamp deliverability requirement to test that prices FlexiRamp more appropriately will also be important as part of the resource efficiency and providing appropriate prices for shortages of ramp and energy. So that's my summary of the issues involved in this. And again, I defer now to Ben and Jim for their comments they want to add.
Thank you, Scott. I have nothing further to add. Jim?
Yeah, nothing from me either.
Okay, so Kiara, we're ready to take comments or questions from the phone lines if there are any.
Please press pound 2 on your telephone's keypad if you'd like to ask a question. There are no questions in the queue.
Okay,
Ben, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. So this is the third of 3 parts, and I'll summarize this one, which is our analysis of the make-whole payment provisions for imports and HASP. So the HASP is a very interesting and unique creation among ISOs in that the hour-ahead scheduling process creates financially binding schedules for block imports to the interties, as well as doing physical unit commitment within the ISO footprint. But the settlement prices are from a subsequent market process, the 15-minute market. And as a result, you can get an inconsistency between the physical import schedule and the prices that they are settled at, with either the prices, the 15-minute prices being greater than the supporting prices or the prices in HASP, or being less. And if the 15-minute prices are less than the HASP prices, then the imports have the import schedules that have been accepted have a risk that their as-bid costs will not be covered. Now, this inconsistency or potential inconsistency of scheduling in one process and then calculating prices in another could be solved by simply creating another market that has that both schedules and settles based on consistent prices, imports, exports, and within California transactions. And this is something that we encourage the ISO to consider. We note that in other markets, especially in Europe, that intraday scheduling and pricing processes have been developed. Very different in their details from what U.S. markets would do in terms of use of LMP and full network model and so forth. But nevertheless, the fact that some of these markets, like the German market, have become quite popular, and in part because they take advantage of the much better resource forecast that you get, say, 3 and 4 hours ahead of time as opposed to 30 hours ahead of time. This is something well worth considering. But of course, it's beyond the doubt that this is not something that we could even start talking about before this summer, but it's something that we think should be considered in the longer term. Another longer term enhancement that would help these markets is to have full scarcity pricing, which would encourage load-serving entities to contract intraday or even further ahead of time, rather than waiting until has to conclude a lot of the transactions. So in terms of options that were considered for this summer, there were a couple that the ISO offered, so-called options 1 and 2. And there's also option, and I'll just call it option 3, which is kind of an umbrella for options proposed by stakeholders. So option 1 would settle imports the higher of half or 15-minute prices. So that would require the development of settlement systems that would capture and apply the hash prices appropriately. Option 2 would provide a make-whole payment if it turns out that upon looking at the accepted block imports, if their as-bid costs exceed the settlement for the 15-minute market, there would be a payment. And then the third option is just to always pay the hash price, which is perhaps similar in spirit to what I was just suggesting about creating a full market around hash. If we take as a first criterion, is this something that can be implemented by the summer, although the ISO offered option 1, and option 3 was something suggested by stakeholders upon closer consideration, rejiggering the settlement systems to track and apply hash prices turns out to be would be a heavy lift and might also have unintended consequences. So we agree that it's not reasonable to try to implement something like that before the summer, especially considering that many of the stakeholders were concerned that the ISO was putting already too much on its plate in terms of what it would try to do before the summer. So that leaves option 2, and not a lot of choice. This is known as Hobson's choice. You basically get the next horse. But I think that actually is something that's a reasonable thing to do, and we agree that it's a reasonable thing to do. And in particular, in some, we think that it would satisfy the criteria of being practical and implementable. It would ameliorate the risk of the settlements being less than the as-bid costs of block imports. It satisfies the desire to have no more changes than are needed to encourage import supply. We, of course, are concerned about anything that would weaken incentives for 15-minute bidding by imports. In fact, when this system was implemented, we had hoped that it would encourage imports to bid more flexibly. And, of course, this has been somewhat disappointing that this hasn't happened to the extent that it had been anticipated. But so the incentive would be weakened somewhat, but this is mitigated in part because option 2 would only be triggered under pretty narrow circumstances. There's either an alert notice the day before that says there's going to be an operating reserve deficiency, or in the day of there's a warning or emergency notice that there's going to be an operating reserve deficiency. So there'll be some weakened incentive, but it's not something that we're terribly concerned about because it shouldn't be. We hope that it's not invoked too often. Another criterion is that we prefer that the proposal not increase perceived discrimination against internal ISO resources that would be settled at 15-minute prices, whereas imports might get a scooch more because of the bid cost recovery. Again, if this is not done frequently, then the amount of increased discrimination is relatively small, and we hope would be eliminated in the long term by a redesign of the HAS process and market. There's a concern that the proposal would be susceptible to gaming, and there are two types of games that we're concerned. The first type are round-trip transactions where you import under one set of prices and turn around and export the same amount at another set of prices, and if the price you're paid for the import is more than what you have to pay for the export, then you can get a profit, a round-trip positive profit. And, of course, this is something that goes back to the Enron games that is always a possibility in these markets when you have multiple sets of prices floating around, and market participants can wind up arbitraging them and have a money pump. So that's one. And another strategic concern is that anytime you have bid cost recovery, then there's an incentive to inflate your as-bid costs up to and just below the point at which your offer would be rejected, because what you get paid will depend on your bid. And, of course, compared to a market clearing type process where everybody is paid the first price, this can be inefficient because you have an incentive to try to guess where that price will be, and if you guess wrong, you might be out of the market, and what is accepted instead is actually an import whose costs are less than yours. And another inefficiency arises just simply from a dead weight cost of having to have staff to try to estimate the prices so you can figure out how much you can shade your offers upwards without being out of the market. So these are both concerns in terms of, but since the applicability of option 2 would be only in these narrow circumstances, in the case of the first strategy, you're unlikely to see opportunities for exports, and so we don't think the round-trip type of game is likely to be extensive. I mean, there's always a chance of this, and DMM and the ISO need to look at this and be able to pounce if it turns out that it is a problem. but we think it's unlikely to, but please watch. And then second, in terms of the bid cost recovery, a game of inflating your offer but still being chosen, it's attractive if you can predict what the past clearing prices are. And if it occurs often, and both conditions are likely. It's going to be hard to predict. We can be fairly certain of that, and we all hope that it won't be invoked very often. But because we might be wrong, the DMN should monitor this. Let's see. Finally, the final issue that came up with option 2, mentioned by a couple of stakeholders, concerns cost allocation. In particular, does the allocation of the costs, the uplift associated with bid cost recovery, will it conform with cost causality and possible fairness principles? And it was argued by, I believe, Idaho Power, for example, that to allocate costs as now would be the case to exports by the ISO in the EIM market would be unfair in this circumstance, since the problem would not have been caused by them. And I do note that in those comments, Idaho Power themselves admitted that this will probably not happen very often. And rather than slow this up or make this initiative any more complicated, we believe it's reasonable to leave the cost allocation as it is. Keep an eye on it. If it turns out that it is a problem, that this is something that can then be addressed afterwards, and of course should be addressed in the longer term if there are more fundamental reforms that are made. So, to summarize, we think that option 2 is going to be effective in eliminating the potential for material reductions in import supply because of these risks, at least during the stress conditions that we care most about, and that this option 2 would be triggered during. We can't predict what difference it would have made in August or what difference it will make in the future, but we think it's in the right direction. We do not anticipate, by definition, we don't anticipate unanticipated consequences. That's, of course, a tautology, but we don't see that possibility as being a great danger, but of course the situation should be monitored. In the longer term, we definitely encourage the ISO to, first of all, investigate why importers and intertie owners continue to schedule on an hourly block basis rather than a 15-minute basis. It's not technology. There are other reasons, and perhaps these reasons can be understood. The ISO could work with intertie owners and others to try to encourage more 15-minute scheduling to actually further the goals of the FERC order concerning 15-minute scheduling between systems. We also encourage consideration of a HASP market with everybody participating and settlement prices being applied with a 15-minute granularity. We think that would be worthwhile, especially because of the improvement in forecasts that you'll have several hours out. And we can certainly take some inspiration from what's happened in Europe, where these intraday markets, especially in Germany, are immensely popular and have much higher volumes than the real-time market. Keeping in mind, of course, that East is East and West is West, and we have very different institutions between here and Europe. So at this point, Chiara, I think, let me check with Jim and Scott, see if you want to add anything to what I've said.
Not from Scott.
This is Jim. I'll just add, you basically said this, but I'll reiterate that there isn't really a perfect or even maybe good solution here. There's just sort of either you risk underpaying imports, which isn't great, or you risk some kind of incentive game like Ben described. As long as we have this sort of half market that's sort of a half market, there really isn't a clean solution to this. The obvious solution it would be to make the HASP more of a two-way financially binding market like all the other markets, or somehow roll everything into a 15-minute market. But as long as we have this sort of partial market, we're going to have to choose between two evils, maybe a little strong, but two less than desirable situations. And, you know, it's a matter of which problem you prioritize trying to resolve. And this is a renewed focus on getting available supply at the potential expense of opening up some of these other problems that have been discussed and were among the reasons why this wasn't adopted in the first place. So, yeah, I think given the renewed emphasis on reliability and getting as many imports as possible during situations like this, it seems like a reasonable step to take.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jim. Oh, and I will footnote that this is a very different discussion than ERCOT, say, can have, because we're very lucky to be able to have the West and folks who are willing to sell to us, and the diversity of resources and so forth. And, ERCOT's problems are very different and arguably more acute because they don't have that possibility. So they won't be lucky that we have the HASP process. It's not perfect, as Jim says, but it provides tremendous benefits to California consumers. So, operator, Kiara, can you see whether there's anybody on the phone lines would like to jump in with a question or a comment?
We do have a single question in the queue.
Okay, great.
Caller, you're
welcome.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So just a question or comment for anyone who wants to field it. First, I just really appreciate the completeness of the opinion and the broad thinking that went into it. It seems like it's a great starter for the Q2 initiatives that the CAISO has on the map for resource efficiency and scarcity pricing. And kind of in that vein, looking at the long-term solutions you were just talking about as far as the potential to have a intraday market and potentially, the full scarcity pricing framework, just kind of based on what you looked into with the resource efficiency evaluation, do you feel like either of those two long-term solutions could also be a significant benefit for the resource efficiency framework, or do you see any link there?
Okay, thanks for the question. I'm going to defer to Scott on this one. Scott, if you have a reply.
Well, I guess the scarcity pricing will have, implications for resource efficiency, and particularly maybe for, resource efficiency due to ramp constraints and things like that are hard to model in any kind of standard forward evaluation. So, we do think that better scarcity pricing will avoid the need to get too microscopic in applying the resource efficiency test and maybe have unintended consequences there.
Yeah, I'll add. I guess it's
market?
Well, in the FMM market, because the HASP is prices, will only be setting prices now and then. As we just said, there'll only be uplift payments. They won't be normal market prices from the HASP.
And I guess I was asking just kind of more broadly, and you mentioned kind of as a potential long-term solution of having that intraday market of the HASP being binding. if the CAISO was to go in that direction, like you suggested, do you feel like that would help the resource sufficiency framework?
Well, the resource sufficiency framework is already based on the HASP evaluation, so having it be financially binding, it might, I guess it might help, but it wouldn't help the problem that the CAISO, that we pointed to in the opinion, that the CAISO's objective function for the HASP is not consistent with the resource sufficiency test. So whether the HASP is binding or non-binding, that's going to be an issue the CAISO likely will have to address if this test becomes, a factor. If the HASP becomes a binding settlement, then we'd want to have, have shortage prices in it as well as in other time frames. But right now, right now we don't have them anywhere. So we'll start with RTD and FMM, and then when we have a binding HASP, we want to extend them to that.
Okay. Thanks for expanding the thinking there. I appreciate that.
Okay.
I'll just add very high level. Over the long run, I'd like to sort of revisit a discussion about what exactly the resource sufficiency test is designed to achieve and what it's designed to discourage, and try to focus particularly the sanctions on, or the penalties for failing the resource sufficiency test to be consistent with what those objectives are. Because you can kind of see when the discussion's about, well, what should the penalties for failure be? If you make them too onerous, then you're just discouraging participation at all. Certain types of penalties might actually just make the reliability situation even worse. And so there is this interesting balance there, and I do think kind of going back to first principles and trying to match exactly what criterion we use to measure it and what the right kind of penalty should be should start from that.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Kara, is there anybody else on phone lines?
Yes, let's move to the next caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Jerry Melcher with the Public Advocate Office. Good afternoon. So my question comes is, if I'm a resource, am I always required to sign up for default energy bids? Is it a truth statement?
Default energy bids are calculated for every resource. They're calculated by the CAISO and DMM for each resource. So there's no option to not have default energy bids.
Okay, so if every resource has a default energy bid, which I assume Texas didn't have this mechanism, why would I bid anything more than my default energy bid? Because I'm going to get my price brought back down through the default energy bid. So why would I not just be bidding that as my cap price into the market? You were saying people weren't bidding high prices, but I can't bid high prices than I can make, right? Because you've artificially capped me.
Resources are only subject to mitigation based on the default energy bid when they fail the pivotal supplier test. It's not, the bids are not capped at default energy bids all the time. They're only capped when there's a potential for the exercise of market power. So resources in normal operating conditions where they don't expect to fail the pivotal supplier test and their costs are different, they'll bid higher or lower than the default energy bid.
Okay, thanks.
And the logic was, I guess if you're a perfectly competitive firm, you would just bid your actual bid, which hopefully is close to the DEB, but we never know. But if you have this cost recovery component playing into it, then that just changes the cost benefit relationship between how high your bid can go and the consequences of bidding too high.
Yeah, well, you've constructed a market where you're trying to arbitrarily figure out when the market's going from an elastic situation to an inelastic situation. And you can never figure that out, but you kind of screw yourself if you don't have every LFE covered with RA contracts. And that's kind of not what's been happening. So then we get into a supply constraint where you export 3,000 megawatts that aren't linked to a physical resource. I just don't get what you guys do. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Jerry, for the comment and question. Carrie, do we have any other comments or questions on the phone line?
There are currently no questions in the queue. As a reminder, dialing #2 will place you in the question queue. We have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. All right. So we'll now proceed to consider adoption of the opinion, and I'll entertain a motion to do so.
Scott moves to adopt it.
I second.
Okay. It's been moved by Dr. Harvey and seconded by Dr. Bushnell to adopt the opinion on summer 2021 readiness, excuse me. And I'll just point out that we will be correcting the date of the opinion to 2021. And there's one other small typo, the tenth of a word later in the opinion, but nothing of substance. Jim or Scott, is there anything else you want to point out needs correction or additions in the opinion?
Not by Scott.
Yeah, not by me.
Okay. I won't bother to make that typo a formal amendment to the motion, if that's okay.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so we're ready to take a vote then. So this is the vote on the motion to adopt the opinion on market enhancements for the summer 2021 readiness. Scott?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And I vote yes. And so the vote is unanimous to adopt the opinion on market enhancements for the summer 2021 readiness. And this will be, the final one will be posted and provided to the board, the EIM board for their meeting next week, and to the governing board of the California ISO. Okay, and at this point I'll just say that there are other elements in the summer 2021 readiness enhancements that will be considered in separate opinions, one of which will likely be posted next week on the minimum state of charge. And let's see. Let me check to see with Jim and Scott if there's any other business that you'd like to raise at this point.
No.
Nope.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So that concludes this meeting, the Market Surveillance Committee. Operator, you can now close the phone line.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.